I'm Victoria Holt. I'm the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, and I am delighted to host this event today called Can Diplomacy Still Solve Global Challenges and Build Peace? So in general, we host these events to try and bring the world to Dartmouth, also have all of us be better in the world. And I often recall John Sloan Dickey, who was the president of Dartmouth's mantra to his students after World War II, which is, the world's problems are our problems, and there's nothing that better humans cannot fix. But what he meant by that was to both have the reasoning skills to understand what's going on in the world, but also have the tools to do something about it. And so this event is really in that spirit. And I think, in a sense, diplomacy tries to combine both understanding the world, but also understanding what tools need to be put together to try and address the challenges, which are ever going on. It's not like one time is more worrisome than another, although sometimes it feels that way. So at the heart of a lot of policy and practice, if you think of an issue you care about, is diplomacy. It's hard to find an issue that's in international affairs where behind the scenes, people aren't trying to figure out what's going on, figure out what people think about it, put that team together, and hopefully move forward and take these differences and try and resolve them through political expression and other means short of war and short of conflict. It can feel a little overwhelming, which is why I'm so delighted that we have Ambassador Ruggles with us. Ambassador Ruggles is actually our current Magro family distinguished visitor in residence. This is a really wonderful program for us. We're able to bring practitioners to campus for a term or two. We're delighted Ambassador Ruggles was able to be with us last term, and she taught a class. And then we were able to persuade her, she actually tells me she likes the winter, to stay on for another term to engage with all of us and work with students and our faculty on big issues. So Ambassador Ruggles had over 30 years in senior leadership in the U.S. as a career Foreign Service officer, including as an ambassador, multiple diplomatic positions. Probably some of them you would never hear of, but are critical, such as reopening our diplomatic mission in Paris at UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, after the U.S. had withdrawn, and re-entering that on behalf of the United States. She's also been the senior representative head of delegation to major international telecommunication union negotiations. We'll look forward to her telling us why that was important. Maybe perhaps more familiar is she's also served the role as U.S. ambassador to Rwanda. She was Ambassador Susan Rice's deputy when she was the cabinet-level appointee serving the United States at the United Nations and on the Security Council. She's been the acting assistant secretary for international organizational affairs. And she's also spent some time outside of government in roles at the Woodrow Wilson Center and National Defense University. And I was really impressed how quickly she took to teaching and education. It's something she had honed before she got here. She's had multiple other roles. I think I've hit some of the big ones. We'll find out more. So the format of tonight is I will join her in a minute. We'll start a conversation. But as you all know, we really like this to be a broader discussion than just the two of us. So after we warm up a bit, I'll turn to all of you to ask questions, to engage, to offer your thoughts. And hopefully we will all continue to think about the great issues and what we can do about it. Just one more note. I want to thank my Dickey Center colleagues who always make these things possible. Whether it's Judith Johnson, I see Nala Waddell here, Naomi Wade, Maddie Sawyer, I think Noah's in the room, and my other colleagues who help put these things together. It really makes a difference and makes it look professional and let us focus on the topic. So, all right, are we ready?
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. So 30 years, what does that mean? I was really struck when we sat down to think about some of the issues to go over that. Just to understand the scope of this, you've worked for 6 different presidents,
Yep.
3 of each party,
Yep.
over 9 different administrations.
Yes.
So I guess my first question is almost more structural. It's like, how do you do that? How do you work for so many diverse points of view? You know, the United States famously brings in a new president and will completely shift in large areas of foreign policy. Other areas remain stable. But as a career diplomat, what's your job? How do you do that? And what do you do if you don't always agree with the policy that's being brought in?
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, I want to say thank you, and thank you as well to our colleagues at the Dickey Center who have been enormously welcoming to me. And it's nice to see some of my students from last semester here in the room, as well as other students who I've had the pleasure of meeting. This really is an enormously welcoming institution, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. As far as your question goes, The career diplomatic service is much like the career military service. We serve the people and the Constitution of the United States. Our oath is exactly the same as the president's, to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and the rest of the oath. But there's nothing in there about loyalty to any person or any specific policy. We are sworn to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, which is a document that is fairly unique in human history because it gives rights to individuals to control their government, which means that we have to listen to all people across the United States, including people with whom we disagree, and people with whom we agree, and listening to the disagreements between them. And so that is very reflective of our politics in policy. And our job as career diplomats is to reflect that to the world, because we are serving the interests of our country and of you all. So I always, whenever I had Americans at my house in Rwanda, I would say, welcome to your home. I am simply the squatter who lives here temporarily. But this is your home here in Rwanda, and you should feel welcome here because it is all of you who own all of our diplomatic properties, but also who are our ambassadors overseas as much as we are. Because when we go overseas to serve you all, we are reflecting the diversity of opinion, of race, of origin, of everything that this country represents to the country where we are posted, but then also reflecting that same thing from our country of posting back to the United States, because countries are not monoliths. Our country certainly isn't. There's lots of very diverse opinions here. There's lots of diversity in people and language and everything else. Well, guess what? Same thing. Overseas, when I was Consul General in South Africa, a country with 8 official languages and another 12 unofficial languages, that's a pretty diverse country with a lot of history. And if I'm not reflecting back all of the diversity of opinions and thoughts and disagreements back to our country, then we don't have a good understanding of what they are wanting and needing from us and from our partnership with them. Yeah. And that's really what we are about, is building long-term partnerships through those ups and downs, hills and valleys of changes in policy, because you all are counting on us to build those long-term partnerships around the world for our own security.
So maybe I'll ask you about something I know you worked on between 2000 and 2001. Mm-hmm. By the way, if you took a peek at her syllabus last term, we know each other through issues of peace and security, and I think it included global climate change, rising inequality, governance structures, including authoritarianism, and technology and AI. I'm like, where's the diplomacy here? So we're going to go there. But you worked on something called PEPFAR, which does not roll off everybody's tongue, but had to do with a major global health issue at the time. And you did it in a transition between 2 different administrations who presumably had very different views. Can you tell us a little bit about the origins of that and how you as a diplomat got involved in it? Yeah, so in the second Clinton administration, I was privileged to serve as a director for African Affairs at the White House. And one of my roles there was to look for emerging security problems. And from 1997 to 2000 was really when the HIV epidemic in Africa got rolling. And we went from a couple 100,000 infections to a couple million infections in 18 months. And it was mostly heterosexual transmission, but came with a lot of the stigma that the HIV crisis had here in the United States. At that point, we had ARVs available, the very first round. What's an ARV? Antiretroviral treatments for HIV had become available in the United States and in Western Europe, but they were very, very expensive, about $10,000 a year, way beyond the reach of governments and individuals in African and developing countries to pay for. And so it was clear that a whole lot of people were going to die. Literally millions of people were going to die. That's a problem when millions of people are getting infected with a disease that is treatable and we're doing nothing. It's a moral problem for us as
the wealthiest country in the world, but it's also a problem for us security-wise, because a lot of these countries had emerged from many years of dictatorship. Democracy was on the rise. Economies were opening up. South Africa had just, was just going through its first changeover in leadership. Rwanda had emerged from genocide. And we were trying to make sure that the continent was stabilizing rather than destabilizing. And if you look at the people who were getting infected, it was people between the ages of 15 and 35 largely, i.e. your young labor force, and largely people who were urban, increasingly urban, so they're young, youthful, better educated labor force and military were the people who were getting infected. And so they were going to destabilize their economies, their militaries, and potentially their governments. And so that's a national security concern for us as we're trying to build out stronger, more secure, more stable, more prosperous partners in Africa. So
you got this problem.
So we got this problem.
Doesn't seem like there's an obvious answer.
And nobody cared. It was, we went screaming, trying to get funding for this. We managed to cobble together, we, being a bunch of people who worked on Africa, managed to cobble together $140 million across 7 agencies of the government, which is budget dust. And when you're talking $10,000 for one person's treatment a year, it doesn't go very far. But we managed to cobble that together and get that put together in the last year of the Clinton administration. We put it into a book. As one does at a transition, you put all your information into a book and you hope somebody reads it and you hope somebody briefs it. And we handed it over to the next administration. It's like, here's this big, hairy problem. Here's what we were able to accomplish. Here's what you need to be looking at. And a couple of people within the Bush team, George W. Bush, when they came into office, took that and had at least looked through it. And when some very conservative people inside the administration suggested that they eliminate HIV funding, those people said, wait, hang on. There's this huge problem. We can't do that. And mother-to-child transmission was a really big deal in sub-Saharan Africa, where women who were HIV positive, who didn't know they were HIV positive, were transmitting it to their babies. And they used that to get the president's attention. And he said, okay, big problem. What are you going to do about it? And they said, oh, here's what the Clinton folks were doing about it. We have this lovely book. Somebody read our book and brought it to the president. It's amazing when that happens.
Do you really think they said this is the Clinton plan? What do you think?
They did. They told us because they asked us to come in and brief them before they went in to brief the president. Now, did they actually hand him the book? Probably not. But they did brief it, and they said this is as far as they got. And Bush took one look and said, to his eternal credit, and said, it's not enough, get me a better plan. And they came back with a plan for $400 million, tripling. And we were all like, yay, rah, go, you guys, because they were asking us what we thought on the sidelines. And Bush was like, no, not enough. So they went back and they doubled it. They got up to $1.4 billion, and he was like, okay, that we can do. Well, we've now spent $120 billion. We lowered the price of HIV drugs. Working with President Clinton, Bush called him up and said, will you help me pressure the drug companies? And he did. So bipartisan work. They got a bipartisan bill through Congress that has been renewed twice now. It's up for renewal again, unfortunately, this year, by March. And we have spent more money on this one disease than any country in history has ever spent. And we've saved 35 million people from getting HIV/AIDS, including 14 million children from getting HIV from their mothers. Worth $120 billion in my book? Yes. But more importantly, we've helped those countries' health systems develop so that they can deliver vaccines. We've cut under 5 child deaths. We've cut maternal deaths. We've enabled COVID vaccinations. We've virtually eliminated polio on the back of the health system that we built because we had this money available. So that is a huge stabilizing effect, but also a huge healthful economic effect that has helped increase our trade and everything else. Made us richer, made us stronger at the same time that it helped other people.
And this was in partnership with, I'm sure, the governments in these countries.
100%. Absolutely. Governments and people and NGOs. Very, very importantly, NGOs.
Excellent. I recall when we first met, I was not a career officer. I was a staff person. I had been asked and brought into government primarily to work with Ambassador Holbrooke, who was trying to respond to congressional legislation to get reforms at the United Nations when he was the perm rep there. So it was the domestic side of foreign policy.
Yep.
And you were working for Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Thomas Pickering, who's quite legendary in these circles.
Yep.
And I think for both of us, it was that moment where the juxtaposition between domestic demands and then actually engaging with other countries to make those demands met was a constant conversation about communications.
Yep.
In that case, we were successful after quite some hard work, which is another story. But it gets to why does the U.S. engage in multilateral institutions? Mm-hmm. The joke in Washington is it would be much better, but it's full of foreigners or something. So, but on the other hand, it's a huge diplomatic space, and you've operated in it for much of your career. One story I don't understand is the International Telecommunications Union, which you said was originally the International Telegraph Union.
Yep.
I think this is perennially on the list for Capitol Hill of things that should get cut because it sounds incomprehensible and a waste of money, but I'm going to give you a chance to tell us why that's not necessarily the right way to see it.
Well, like all international institutions, it reflects its membership, 196 countries with all their different ideas, and much like our Congress and Congress people with all their different ideas and different constituencies and different needs, it doesn't work very efficiently, and it's not meant to work efficiently. It's meant to work slowly so that everybody is heard and so that you can reach compromise, which can be very, very frustrating for a country like the United States, which has a lot of big ideas and wants to move quickly, and we have short administrations. So a lot of people get frustrated by these things. But we built all these international institutions for a couple reasons. The big UN, built after World War II, was built to prevent nuclear war. It's done a really good job of that for 80 years. Thank you very much. Yes, we did a good job. And if that's all it's accomplished, saving humankind from nuclear holocaust, I think that's okay. You know, it's done a lot else besides that. So one of its agencies actually predated the UN by almost 100 years. It's 157 years old, the International Telegraph Union. Started out because we strung a telegraph wire under the Atlantic Ocean to Europe, and they wanted to charge for people receiving telegraphs on the other end. So we were charging people on our end, and they were charging people on their end, and people were getting double taxed, right? And so we said, this isn't fair. You know, you're receiving a telegraph, you don't know, you may not have money to pay for it, but you need the information. So everybody agreed that we would set up this body to figure out how this was going to be paid for and who was going to do the maintenance and all of that, but also how we were going to do fees. Hence the ITU, and hence only senders of telegraphs had to pay, and the people who received didn't. And no matter where you were sitting, it was only the sender who paid. Whether you're on a ship, whether you're on land, didn't matter. So when telephones got up and running, it became the same deal. And we just stuck telephones underneath it, and we said, okay, now it's telecommunications. And then when mobile telephony started happening, we said, okay, well, there's mobile phones now. And oh, by the way, we started sending up these things called satellites. And well, that's mobile, okay, so we'll put it in the ITU. There's a body that knows how to do this. And so when we first got these lovely devices, they were bricks, first of all, and they didn't have the nice screen and didn't do half of what they do. But you had to carry 4 or 5 of them, one for Japan, one for Europe. If you're going to the UK, that was a separate device. Canada was a different one. US was a different one. At one trip around the world that I took with Undersecretary Pickering, I had 6 of these phones that I had to keep changing as I went because everybody's systems were different. And ITU said, this is super inefficient, it's creating a lot of waste. We are going to regulate this so that everybody's phones have to work on everybody else's systems. Thank you, Japan and Canada, for your totally different systems. You're out. You have to work off of what we agree the mass of the systems are, which had ended up being what kind of the European US standard. And everybody else adopted it. made our companies a lot wealthier, but it also made it a lot cheaper for everybody to go around the world with one phone, and they pay their home carrier. You don't pay a whole bunch of different people. You used to have to do that, but not anymore. And everybody can get Wi-Fi in airplanes because we've allocated airwaves for Wi-Fi in airplanes. We've allocated, we, the ITU, has agreed to this. And those things are very, very, very valuable, right? I mean, getting wavelength for TV, for radio, for air traffic control, it's getting very crowded up there. You can see it gets jammed up. So being able to shoot your data up to a satellite and back down, that's $1 billion in billions and billions of dollars of industry.
So how does like a diplomat get involved in something like that?
Oh, we get to negotiate all those agreements. It's really fun. And we also get to negotiate who leads. So what I was put in charge is we were trying to get an American elected for the first time in 95 years, and the first woman ever in the 157 years of this institution to lead it. An uber-qualified American diplomat against a well-qualified Russian. This is why U.S. leadership matters. Who do we want leading these institutions? She took over from a Chinese guy who'd led the institution on and off for 16 years. Do we want China and Russia making the rules for who gets satellite allocation? Or do we want us or friends helping us do that? That's why U.S. leadership in these organizations matters. And when we walk away, we go blind. And other nations will fill that vacuum.
Well, all right, so I'm going to turn to the audience early, but I've got another question for you first, which is, so your course. Instead of teaching the history of diplomacy or talking about, the founding of organizations or looking at current conflicts, it sounds like you really teed up some really tough issues where we may not have easy answers. So I can revisit your list: climate, rising inequality, authoritarianism and governance structures, and then technology and AI. So give us a little flavor of what you were trying to convey. Like, how does diplomacy tackle things that societies haven't figured out yet?
Well, a couple of my students can probably weigh in on this as well. But what we were discussing, and it really was we discussing in this course, because I don't have all the answers. And what I wanted to do was provoke the discussion and the lifelong learning that all of you all are going to need to tackle these problems, which are going to dominate your life. Climate change is not going away anytime in your lifetime or my lifetime, and probably not your children's lifetime. This is a big, hairy problem, and we need to start figuring out how we talk about this and how we are going to negotiate this and what the big issues are and what we need to tackle first, second, third, fourth, and really looking at those big issues and what the impacts are going to be economically, security, et cetera. Same thing with AI, and AI is linked to climate change because of energy use for AI and emerging technology. The fifth and sixth generations of AI that are coming out now, fifth gen AI is just coming out now, forget quantum computing, use 10 times as much energy as your regular Google search. So that little AI box that pops up now on your screen that you can't get rid of in your Google search, the energy usage to get that data to your screen is 10 times what your old Google search used to be. And that's why Google and Microsoft and Amazon are all trying to buy nuclear power plants, including 3 Mile Island, so that they can power their data centers. That's why this huge Stargate investment was announced yesterday, because we are going to need to find that energy, or we're going to need to curb our ambition, or we're going to have to figure out something that's more efficient. And we're going to have to do that really fast, because it will chew our climate pledges to shreds in 2 years or less. And then what are the ethics of that? Who's falling further and further behind, and who's getting further and further ahead? Should one person really control $1 trillion? Should one person control more of the global economy than 50% of the population of the world? Is that a recipe for stability? I don't think so. And then how does that play into authoritarianism and this rising tide of populist division that we see around the world? It's not just here, although it's here as well. And how do we tackle those questions and really work together as communities to really think about how can we partner with others around the world to tackle these hard questions. So that's really what we spent the term talking about. We didn't have a lot of answers, but we had a lot of really good ideas about where we can start. And that, I think, I'm super, super proud of my students. They really dug into this, and hopefully they're spreading some of this around.
I listened to that list of issues, and you think about sort of the structure of U.S. government decision-making. And my mind goes to the structure at the White House. I'm like, well, there isn't really an office on that or that, let alone integrating and then making choices. I know others in the audience have thought about this. How do you tee those up to which ones you prioritize in the short run and the long run? And so knowledge coming in and out of government seems to be one of the themes that you're very aware of and wanting to do. So, as I suggested, not a traditional diplomatic chit-chat about tea with country X, and we could go to nonproliferation, we could go to current conflicts, we could talk about some of the classic issues, we could go to the headlines, but I did promise the audience that I would start looking out to kick off some of these questions as well. So if you'd like to, excellent. I think we've got two folks with microphones here. All right, I see Maddie and Noah.
And Prescott.
We've got two hands over here. Yes, students first.
Here?
Thanks.
Thank you so much for coming. I'd love to hear more about your experiences on working with autocratic governments, both on the bilateral and multilateral level, and specifically when you've found, in your experiences, when are the right moments to try and find common ground with countries that have fundamentally different values?
Yeah, it really depends on the issues that you're working on, the issue set that you're trying to tackle. It's very hard to work with autocratic governments on human rights. So when I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor working in the Middle East, I spent a lot of time working with the government of Saudi Arabia on human rights issues, especially women's rights issues. But I had a good partner in the U.S. government who worked with me on these. And he would go in and he would be the one who would raise human rights, and I would raise terrorism and security issues and how they dealt with terrorist suspects in their jails and their judicial system. And we had a good tag team effort because it was unexpected for them, and they were expecting me to be the women's rights gal and him to be the terrorism guy, and we flipped the script on them. And it actually changed the conversation. And so knowing who you're dealing with and what they're expecting and figuring out ways to change the conversation is really, really, really important when you're dealing with issues that are very tough. And because we came at it with a very open perspective, we were able, for the first time ever, to bring Sharia court judges who had never traveled outside of Saudi Arabia to the United States, bring them all over the United States for a month, including to our Supreme Court, to a state Supreme Court, and to local jury trials, which do not exist in Sharia law, to expose them to different ideas about how justice can be administered by local citizens who are not trained judges. And how do you do that? And they were astonished that they actually were super intrigued by the whole jury trial system, which they had never been exposed to. And it really helped their understanding, but also we brought them into law schools and had them teach classes on Sharia law, which at the time, this was during the Bush administration, was a really big topic about how do we deal with this in the terrorism context. And it really helped understanding in our law schools as well. And so giving some respect to their positions while also helping them to understand our side of the thing really did change the conversation about that and helped us get access to their jails, helped us get access to thinking with them how they could better administer their judicial system electronically because they were still handwriting all their opinions and things. So, it's incremental progress, but where you can make progress, you try. Sometimes you fail, but you keep trying. and you try and do it in new and different ways. So that's just one example, but you don't just say, well, we're never going to get anything on women's rights, right? We're never going to get anything on this. You go in and you try, you get pushback, and you keep trying.
Okay, cool. Thanks. I think I saw Maddie, your hand was up.
Thanks. I can confirm that Ambassador Brooks' Ruggles class was really fantastic and eye-opening. I think all of us can. But I'm curious, both of you served as ambassador to Rwanda, which obviously featured mass atrocities in the past, as well as your Director Holt's experience in peacekeeping operations. So I'm curious to know if you could inform us a little bit about the internal process about declaring that ethnic cleansing or genocide has happened in a country. I'm thinking about the recent declaration of Sudan, and also how that affects the U.S. commitment to act. So that's the first part, and then bringing it to the current moment. We see that the new administration may be taking a more isolationist transactional approach to foreign affairs. What can other domestic actors do to support atrocity prevention and peace-building efforts in the next 4 years?
There's a lot there.
I know.
Sorry.
Do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
Why don't you start, and then I'll come in.
Okay, so on the specific issue of how does the process work to declare a genocide, which is what we have recently done for a second time in Sudan. There is a very rigorous legal process because there is a international as well as a U.S. legal definition of what constitutes genocide. And it has to be targeting of a group with identifiable characteristics, whether that's religious or ethnic or what have you, national origin, for elimination, right? And so that's not a direct quote. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't have it in my head, but it's along those lines. And so there's a very strict legal process. There's also in our law as well as in international law or treaty law, a requirement that we as the international community act and that the U.S. as part of the international community act when genocide is occurring. And this stems out of our situation in World War II, where there was information, minimal and compartmentalized and things like that, but there was information about what was going on in Germany and Poland under the Nazi regime and the Holocaust. And failure, obviously, of the international community to act to stop that fast enough. It has been imperfectly followed. There is a long history, in citing Rwanda, during the Rwanda genocide of everybody dancing around the term genocide because there was no determination made in that first 100 days. And we only made the determination at ex post facto as the genocide was ending. It was at the last week of the genocide that we actually said, okay, a determination has been made. It's an imperfect process that has failed a couple times. We're doing better now, and there's a more routinized process to get going faster, but it's still not perfect.
Well, maybe starting where you landed, which is the legal barriers to actually declaring genocide actually have at times deterred even asking the question. And so a group of policymakers recognized this. And so before I joined government, I was in the Obama administration. I was on something called the Atrocity Prevention Study Group. And it was chaired by Madeleine Albright and former Secretary of Defense Cohen. And the question was not, what's genocide? The question was, how do you prevent mass atrocities? Which you will notice is a different term. So under mass atrocities, it referred to the UN had passed basically resolutions calling for states to protect their own people from atrocity crimes, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and genocide, all with different legal terminology and all that. So we as Americans do, why don't we just say stop mass atrocities? And in doing this study, what was really interesting is if you went to the State Department and knocked on the intel door, or we went to the intel community and said, can you give me the warning list for all the countries at risk of mass atrocities? They would look at you mostly blankly. There had been a group, the Political Instability Task Force, which had been stood up. And so part of the work that we were looking at is how do you get better at identifying not just conflict, not battle-related deaths, but how do you look at internal conflict, often a state attacking its own people or groups going after each other, and get a head start. So the second part is, okay, if you think it's at risk, what do? You don't just wait for it to escalate. What are the range of tools that can be used across the U.S. government and the international community to try and push that curve from escalation back down to manageable differences that don't turn into large-scale violence? And then the third area is crisis response. And a fourth area, which I worked on, is there's a gap in the military. Militaries are traditionally trained. They protect hills and buildings, but you send me in to protect people, and I don't have a library of doctrine that explains how I do that. I can figure it out. I'm smart, the U.S., but that was part of the Rwanda problem, part of the Srebrenica problem, is militaries thought they were upholding a ceasefire, supporting a political agreement, not there to stop people killing each other with machetes or other forms. So we realized, okay, we need guidance and training to militaries, whether they're American or UN peacekeepers. So I lay all this out because it's not an on-off switch. And in the best of worlds, you have governments that, before it lands on the president's desk, have taken 80% off because they've used all the tools of the international community in the US to try and reduce those cases that could land in extreme violence. So the ones that you actually have to determine whether it's genocide or not is hopefully less. There's an amazing lawyer, Todd Buchwald. I think he's since retired.
Yep.
He wrote a whole report on the internal process, if you're curious, about declaring ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and genocide.
Correct.
So, more to say, but thanks for the great question.
Part of her question that y'all didn't address was, and if we make a genocide declaration, what does that
Oh, right, what happens automatically afterwards?
mean?
There is nothing that happens automatically, but we have a requirement to actually report to Congress and to develop a plan that the president has to then either decide yes or no that he is going to move forward. So this is, and this is, where does prevention end and intervention start? And it's a tricky question, right? And there is a bias in our government towards prevention, which I tend to agree with, but we oftentimes get in there so late that we are bordering on intervention, if not doing intervention, and then it becomes a much messier problem.
I think the point she's making in part is it forces an internal decision. And that decision can be no, but it doesn't let it just float. And I think that part has forced hard conversations, and sometimes disappointing ones, about not taking action. But does have tributaries towards other actions that may not appear in the press, but theoretically could. But it's a hard decision to call, and I think we've seen the results of that sometimes both ways. So. All right. I see some hands over here.
Do you mind passing out to the students?
Great to see you both of you once again. Obviously there's a new President Trump right now, so he signed a lot of executive orders, and some of them which include withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, from the World Health Organization, and also freezing the U.S. foreign assistance for 90 days. So there are so many different ways the U.S. can show its leadership, and being, as you say, that being involved in those international organizations and institutions will give the U.S. an opportunity to have its leadership. So if under the current administration, the U.S. keeps withdrawing from international institutions and organizations, at the same time, let's say it reduces its foreign assistance significantly, how much that do you, at the same time, the rising of China, Russia, Iran, and all these things to undermine the U.S. leadership in international system. So how much do you think that the current foreign approach of the Trump administration would really somehow challenge the U.S. leadership in international system, and at the same time will have less bargaining power for the U.S. when it comes to diplomacy and all these things, when the U.S. is suspending its foreign aid or reducing, because those channels are very sometimes helpful for the U.S. to play and maneuver its leadership when it comes to diplomacy and reach a viable agreement which is more beneficial for the U.S. in so many issues. Thank you.
Yeah, it's this is one of those moments where there are a lot of things that are in play. And the announcement of the intention to withdraw from WHO and the Paris Climate Accord are that. They are intentions to withdraw. Both of those processes take a year. There are requirements that you have to give notice a year ahead of time in order to do that, because the US and others are very large donors. We are the largest donor nation in the world to the UN system writ large and to WHO in particular. We constitute about 10% of WHO's total budget, including we are the largest voluntary contributor. So losing that amount of money would be destabilizing. So there are regulations in place that we have agreed to in agreements that it takes a year to withdraw, so they have time to go look for other funding and for others to step up and fill the gaps if somebody leaves like us. So that's the intention. But guess what? These are politicians that are responsive to the US public. Guess who you are? So if you disagree with these things, it is incumbent upon you to tell somebody, perhaps an elected official, that you disagree with that. You have power as the citizens in our Constitution to tell the people in charge of our government that you disagree with decisions that they are making on your behalf that will affect your futures, that are important to you, to your communities, et cetera. If you disagree with these decisions, write your member of Congress, write your senator, write the Secretary of State, write the White House, and do it every day. Literally. Flood them if you disagree with this, because this is intent. This is not yet action. And what they're counting on is everybody to freeze. We've seen this coming. They have said they are going to do these things. If you disagree, tell them that. If you agree, tell them that too. But this is important, that citizens interact with their government. Your government does not impose upon you. You are your government. That's what democracy is about. And if you want the US to lead in the world, because of the reasons that you've laid out, it's really important for you to say that. Now, my personal opinion is that absolutely the US should not only stay, but should continue leading, because we benefit as much as we give to these organizations. How do we benefit? We get early warning on disease and pandemics and things like this, not just for human beings, but for our crops. We're the largest agricultural producer in the world. For our animal crops, bird flu, anybody heard about the huge bird flu epidemics that's happening? That started in Asia. The reason we have been able to slow it down in this country and we haven't had to cull over half of our chicken population and devastate our entire poultry economy is because we had forewarning and we got pathogen samples so that we were able to inoculate a lot of our bird population, our poultry, commercial poultry population. That's a good thing. That's millions and hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of jobs. Why wouldn't we want to participate in that and protect that? Benefits us. Yes, we invest in it, but we're also getting benefit from it. Same thing with the climate agreements. If we are no longer the world's largest polluter, but we have been for years and years and years, so we have a responsibility, first of all, to help mitigate and prevent further damage. But we also can use the force of our economy, our political will, our weight to ensure that India, which is the fastest growing polluter in the world, Brazil, the second fastest growing polluter in the world, Russia, which should not be a big, huge polluter given the size of their economy, but they are because they're all dirty, and China, which is the largest polluter in the world and still growing quite quickly, that they actually take their responsibility seriously as well. And if we walk away, how are we going to get them to take their responsibility seriously?
Thanks very much. Okay. Right here.
We got the green light. Hi, as I'm sure you're aware, the Trump administration has started to dismantle DEI programs in the U.S. government. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit to the effect that might have in the Foreign Service and the State Department and other agencies more broadly. Some of you might know a professor here, Jason Lyle, in the government department. He's written a book on this in military affairs that shows that turns out diversity is really good for military power, and discrimination and exclusion is really bad for it. So I wondered how that might apply to your area. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have found throughout our history that the more people who are included in everything, in government, in decision-making, in the economy, in jobs, the richer we get, the stronger we get, and the more secure we are. So why we wouldn't want to continue that? Kind of beyond me. So again, U.S. citizens have a voice in this. There have been announcements made that this is the intent. There have been policies pushed down saying pause everything. But again, there are laws in place that have been in place, anti-discrimination laws that have been in place since the 1960s for good reason, because we were getting rid of segregation in this country, that are now being challenged. If you think that's a bad idea, you should be writing to your members of Congress, the White House, et cetera, but also talking to your state and local governments about what are they going to do to push back on this. Because state and local governments actually control a lot of your local life, including your schools, including how their governments work, and including how they intend to protect people in your community and how they intend to enforce or not enforce the laws of the United States, which happen to be non-discrimination laws. If you look at I don't have the code number. The EEO regulations are in law that prevent discrimination based on protected categories, including race, ethnic origin, nationality, color, skin color, gender and sex, religion, and there's one on age discrimination. Protected categories. Those are clear in well-established Supreme Court cases across the board. So this is in direct contradiction to that last time I checked. All it needs is for people to shut up and agree, because compliance and being quiet is agreement to let these things happen. And all it takes to stop it is people disagreeing and saying, not on my watch.
I think you're also pointing to what the connection is between the statement of no DEI and what that actually means in practice as far as policies, laws, regulations.
Correct.
And having worked at state, I will say I can agree. The effort to diversify the pool of people coming in as career officers, to recognize that if you're married, that the spouse may need to be accommodated, which was not an original idea. Actually, if you got married at one point, women were asked to leave the Foreign Service. Like some of these
Until 1979.
things, right. Things that we just take for granted that are not seen as DEI maybe in the current time, but might have in the past. You can just say that there's high evidence that we are much stronger as a government for
absolutely.
accommodating and encouraging a diversity of people.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. All right. Any are we over here? And then we'll go here.
Thank you again for being here. You've talked a lot about the merits of democracy. And in the past decade or so, I think there's been a narrative that American democracy is weakening in some ways, and that's a narrative that's also been pushed a lot by Russia and China and others. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on that and how that may bleed into the world of diplomacy and in the Foreign Service and kind of our standing in that realm.
I think there are a lot of countries who hope that the United States is weakening. I've not seen a lot of evidence of that. I would say that maybe our unity is not as strong as it was when I first started my career, but I don't view that as weakening. What I view that is we have a lot more public and rigorous debates overseas than we used to. There used to be a saying, that partisanship stops at the water's edge. And our partisan debates have bled over into foreign policy in a way that I think is unhealthy. But that does not mean that we are weaker. It doesn't mean our economy is weaker, our military is weaker, that our force for moral and value-driven diplomacy is weakened at all. I think quite the opposite, because people see us having these rigorous debates and see us making progress. But what I think has been problematic is this idea that we have two different foreign policies based on which party you're representing, and that bleeds over into how we interact with foreign governments. As I said, when I was the ambassador, I was representing the entire United States of America. Whether I agreed with the policy of the administration or not, I represented that policy because I was representing the United States' foreign policy, but I was also representing the great diversity of ideas. So I went out as ambassador under the Obama administration, and the second half, I served for a year and 8 months under the first Trump administration. I didn't change who I was overnight. I did have to change some of what I was talking about, but not very much, frankly, because at the end of the day, we still believe that having Peace Corps volunteers in the field is really good. We believe that having a USAID working on crop development and community development and STEM education and all the wonderful things that AID does is really important. That advocating for American businesses and trade is important. That working on human rights is important. Everybody sort of agrees on that. And so we continue doing that stuff. And every once in a while, I'd have to sit down and be like, okay, that tweet was a little hard, but you carry on, because the work we're doing for the American people is far too important to get caught up in all that. And I think as long as we as diplomats reflect the entirety of our country and respect the differences of opinions and reflect those, then we're doing our jobs and we're actually doing what our country needs us to do. And we can help change that narrative. And I think we do change that narrative overseas.
All right, thanks very much. Right here. And then, sorry, I'm late. Next up is right here. No, it's okay, Carl, go ahead.
Oh.
Okay.
Thank you. Hi there. I wanted to ask you, there's a lot of talk around the Trump administration, this new approach to foreign policy as being more isolationist. And I think there is a lot of evidence to suggest this may be true. It's removing ourselves from institutions or agreements. That was a great question you asked. I want to push back a little bit on, though, it's not just isolationism. It's also a leaning forward and a willingness, a demonstrated willingness, at least rhetorically so far, to exercise leverage. To exercise leverage that the United States has always had economic leverage. We could always hurt our trading partners by raising tariffs or changing foreign policy, maybe restricting banking and that sort of thing. But we've been quite restrained for decades, and I would argue really in modern history, quite restrained not to do that. So what happens if, this isn't just rhetoric, what happens if the United States does become a coercer? How does that change? And I was hoping, can I ask you to make an argument against that? What are the consequences? We have power. Why shouldn't we use it? Thanks.
So just to clarify, because we know you are an economist, when you say coercion, are you thinking mostly about economic coercion? Or are you also thinking about military force or withdrawing from NATO to coerce different behavior? Like, just play that out a little bit more.
Great question. Yeah, it's really fun talking about this one. And yeah, we can start with economic coercion, the use of trade policy. This is what's clearly on the table already. The promise, the assurance, the threat, I don't know how you want to characterize it, to put new tariffs, additional tariffs of 10% across the board on China by February 1st if they don't crack down on fentanyl. To impose tariffs on Mexico and Canada of 25% for fentanyl and immigration. So it's the use of economic force, but I think one could quite reasonably push a little bit further and say, are there other areas where we could exercise coercion as well? The offering military aid to some countries and not others, or crucially withdrawing military aid to change diplomatic outcomes. Thanks.
Yeah, so we as you rightly point out, we have a huge amount of tools in our toolkit, which we have used in various situations. So we have massive sanctions on Russia because they invaded Ukraine. Economic sanctions, political sanctions, travel bans, all sorts of things, right? We have a similar multi-decade set of sanctions on Iran that is multi-layered across many different agencies that if Iran ever becomes a democracy will take us 10 years to untie. Like literally, there was at one point a overview of this, and it's like 140 different sanction regimes on Iran, so of various sorts. So we have these kind of tools, but we use them rarely, only when our national interests are really at stake or when we are trying to pressure a government to change dramatically policy, whether that's human rights issues or whether that's an economic issue or a security issue. And the restraint that the U.S. government normally exercises is wise in that you're most effective having the power and everybody knowing you have the power and not doing it than actually doing it, because once the cat's out of the bag, it's very hard to take these sanctions off. And it's very hard to change the direction, and we have to deal with counter sanctions, as we saw from China during the first Trump administration. When we slapped on tariffs, they slapped on tariffs back. Raise costs for everybody. Everybody paying more for stuff from China? Yeah, I am. I know that. So that's going to happen again. And codependency and economic integration, global economic integration, which is something that we have championed for the last 60 years, has made us much, much, much wealthier, but also made us much, much more dependent on diverse supply chains, including Canada and Mexico. So Canada is also contemplating, okay, you put tariffs on us, we're going to put tariffs on things like, car parts, that for cars that are assembled in, say, Alabama, which last time they checked as a Republican state because they've taken a tool out of the Chinese toolbox and said, if we want people to pay attention, we're going to target Republican districts. Now, who's that going to hurt? That's going to hurt car workers assembling cars in Alabama who are already in jobs that are hopefully not super low paying, but oftentimes those jobs are not union jobs. Sometimes they are. And they may not have protection, so they may lose their jobs. Why is this in anybody's interest? So figuring out how do we get what we're looking for, which is, in this case, better action on fentanyl, and working in partnership with our partners, and even with our adversaries on these issues, is something that is harder to do, but wiser at the end of the day, in my opinion, because we get more sustainable action when we get agreements and we work in partnership and everybody understands each other's needs. It doesn't mean that people won't cheat. It doesn't mean that China doesn't cheat on the Paris Climate Accords. They do. They cheat massively on the Paris Climate Accords, but they at least can be held accountable because they agreed to it. And so same thing with fentanyl. And so we use these tools wisely or unwisely at risk.
And underlying that, though, I think we recognize there is a debate about what the goal is, right? So as we had some conversations here at Dartmouth this summer, we were talking with people from different backgrounds, economics, government. If you look at China, is China a country we want to cooperate with on climate? Or are they a potential military power that threatens the region, including Taiwan? Or is there space in there where we're dealing with supply chains and economic and trade? So you can look at China and you can see different kinds of relationships. And so an administration comes in and says, we're going to prioritize this. So I don't think it's that the Democrats, for example, will use less coercion than the Republicans. It's that they may have different goals that they want to prioritize, and therefore the tools to get there may be realigned in different ways, right? So I think that's what's interesting. And I think there's also a skepticism of partnerships and allies and multilateral organizations, and that the case for that, and I think I can say this, has not been maybe made as strongly. There's a reference in DC that there's a blob, which is this like foreign policy consensus, which moves forward. But it also means that it can get out of shape for making cases for things. And so when a party comes in or a group of people come in and question it, there can be a lag time in having a conversation about, well, that's why it's been this way. And some of that needs to be shaken up. I think that can be a very healthy thing. So sorry to jump in there.
No, absolutely. And And some of these ideas need to be debated because at the end of the day, we are facing greater competition on the international stage, whether that's Iran, competing with its neighbors in the Middle East, or whether that's China, or whether that's India and China, or Nigeria with its neighbors, whatever. There is greater competition out there in the security space globally, and so figuring out how do we navigate that and what tools do we use to avoid war, which this president says very clearly is his top priority. He wants to avoid war. Okay, great. How do you use these tools most wisely to move away from the potential for conflict and to prevent conflict rather than moving towards conflict?
Yeah. Thanks. I think, Carl, your hand was up in the back. Oh.
My question was actually very similar.
And we have actually a fairly large online audience. We don't use,
Okay,
I'm using
yeah.
the microphone. Yeah.
My question was actually very similar. It's not often that I get to ask a question about the ITU, so I had to pounce. I had to pounce on the opportunity. But specifically with regard to a multilateral institution rather than a bilateral bargaining situation, to what degree is the immense and disproportionate power that the United States has in outer space, just as its largest user, useful or deleterious to diplomatic solutions concerning the problems that we use the ITU to solve, right? I'm thinking especially in the era of proliferated low Earth orbit mega constellations, right? What is the United States' relationship with the ITU? How's it changed since that has become a reality? And to what degree is the United States power useful in achieving diplomatic solutions in that realm? Thanks.
Yeah, so space is becoming crowded. Low Earth orbit satellites and low Earth orbit arrays like Starlink, et cetera, are really crowding the space. Some astronomers actually estimate that you will not be able to see the Milky Way because there will be too many satellites by the time you guys are 50. There will be so many satellites up there that they will obscure the Milky Way. That's kind of crazy. So thinking about that and like that crowdedness of space, are we going to have to start having like airports have like slots where things can shoot up into orbit? And the answer is probably yes. But also, how do we get rid of space junk? So the US, because we and the then Soviet Union, now Russia, were the first up there in space, and we started putting satellites up there before anybody had thought about space allocation and how to avoid collisions, which is a really smart thing to avoid in space. We got to claim big chunks of space. And there was this organizational body that was set up called Intelsat, which was the International Telecommunications and Satellite organization that was headquartered in Washington, D.C., that was sort of an independent agency that helped nations who didn't have the technology to put satellites in space and put them on other people's rockets and stuff like that, so that you could get TV in Africa and in Brazil and places like this, and you could get radio satellite communications. But also started doing the allocation. That got incorporated into the ITU when it became clear that not everybody was included in Intelsat. Like the Africans didn't have a seat, and that was unfair, and so we put it into the ITU where everybody had a seat. So the good news is everybody now gets to vote, and we were responsible for getting that into there. The other good news is that because we helped start this, we took the responsibility to track all this stuff up there. So the US, on behalf of the international community, tracks every single little bolt that has been dropped by an astronaut, or the bits that the Chinese blew up when they blew up their satellite, the millions of pieces that they blew up. They did a test with a laser weapon and blew up one of their own satellites and created space junk all over the place so that it doesn't take down the International Space Station, everybody else's telecom satellites, et cetera, et cetera. And we're starting now to figure out, how do we clean this up? How do we clean up the junk? Where people are thinking about smart vacuums, like to go up and like there's actually two companies, US companies, who've invented these things, and they're testing them out to see if they can go collect space junk and bring it back into orbit, deorbit it, and burn it up as it comes into the atmosphere. Great idea, fabulous, wonderful. Who's going to pay for it? Ooh, that we have to figure out. So this kind of stuff, I would rather us be involved in and leading and helping on, because we have a head start on so much, and also because we share our information. So that information about where all the space junk is, it's on the internet. Anybody can go access it. Like literally every single thing, you can go see it. It's kind of crazy. So I think that that's why our leadership in these things matters, because we have a belief that communicating and sharing information actually helps all of us do better and be more secure and be wealthier and avoid things like space wars, because shooting down other people's satellites is a pretty problematic thing.
All right. Two mentions of ITU. It's a good evening. Okay.
know.
I see a hand in the back right there. And I think we'll have time for like 1-2 more questions, then we'll wrap it up.
All right. So first of all, thank you for your conversation so far. I was wondering if you can talk about the bureaucracy. So I have two questions. The first question is that I noticed that U.S. ambassadors are appointed by the president and then approved by the Congress. Not sure if that's accurate. So then what is your relationship with the existing system of bureaucracy in Rwanda, for example? How do you build that relationship? How do you build a relationship with people who have been working there as professional diplomats for 10 or 20 years? That's my first question. Second question is, how do you see the current or previous administration appointing people who are not necessarily career diplomats into ambassador positions? Thank you.
Yeah, so first of all, yes, you're correct. Ambassadors are appointed by the president. They can be career or they can be political appointees. And they are approved with the advice and consent of the Senate is the exact term in the Constitution, which means you have to go to a hearing and they do a whole bunch of questioning and scrutinizing of your finances and your ethics and everything else. You fill out reams of paperwork and then you wait and they vote, and usually you get through. If you're a career person, oftentimes if you're political, there's a lot more issues. There has been a tradition, and we are one of the few countries that does this, of political appointees. Very, 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 very rare. Most other countries don't do this. A few countries send political appointees to us, like Australia. Their former prime minister is now their current ambassador, Kevin Rudd, in Washington. He's a political appointee. He's not a career diplomat. He's the former prime minister. But we have a fairly long tradition of doing this, going back to the end of World War II, of sending out political appointees, actually going back before that. Traditionally, it's been about 20% of our diplomats are political appointees, and about 80% are career people like me. Those 20% usually go to nice places like Paris and London and Rome, and you see the trend. Canada. They do not go to places like, Burma or Rwanda or a small country in the Caribbean. It's not that we don't care about those countries, it's just those people have usually given a lot of money in a political campaign, and they're fairly wealthy, and they're not interested in going to those places. Whereas we have a lot of experts who speak the language, who've lived in the region, who are really good at what they do in building those networks. They have a lot of history there, and that's what we do. Now, that is not to say that political appointees are bad. I've worked for very good political appointee ambassadors, absolutely. And I've worked for some not so great career ambassadors. So personality and personal, executive leadership capabilities matter a lot. But oftentimes in places like Paris, for instance, you're expected to entertain a lot. And you have this grand, gorgeous house and no money to do the entertainment. You have like a little budget that will pay for like 2 receptions, and that's it. And so you're expected to take that money out of your pocket, whether you're a career or whether you're a big political donor. So somebody who's very wealthy, much more capable of doing that in Paris. In Rwanda, I paid about $10,000 a year out of my own pocket for entertainment, because that's just what was expected. It's part of my job. And that, and you know that going into it. And that's pretty normal. And, it's just part of the job. So you have to balance out these things. There's good and bad with our system, but in general, we try and get it right. And we do a decent job. Where we fall down is this advice and consent piece in the Senate, that it takes forever to get through that process. I was held up for 8 months because there was a dispute over an agricultural bill that had nothing to do with the State Department. And so there was a blanket hold put on by a senator from Iowa, who will remain nameless, on all State Department appointees. And some people waited a year and a half to go out to their embassies in places like Albania and Rwanda, and it was ridiculous. At one point, there was 86 of us who were on hold for no other reason than this person was mad about an ag bill, and we were the hostages. That is dumb and stupid, and it deteriorates our ability to work with the governments who we are being sent to, and to advance U.S. interests, and to build our teams and our networks the way we are supposed to be doing, and that needs to get fixed.
So I see Jason's hand, and then we'll wrap up.
All right, this might be a good one. I'm going to go back to where you started, and really this week, right? So this is an incredible week. It feels like more than a week. So you started with this wonderful story about the briefing books that you handed off, and and how that ultimately translated into policy changes, even beyond what you were necessarily calling for. So do you think something like that? Are there books that were written and handed off? Do you think they will be read, and any sort of hope for those same sort of outcomes? And then a second kind of connected question is, we've seen some announcements, I don't know if they're actually policy yet now. They seem novel, but like, for example, Greenland, right? Or, we're going to, buy Greenland or whatnot. But those have analogs. Like sometimes those issues come up a lot. The United States has purchased a lot of land over the past. So on that issue and others, do you think this is novel? Do you see any, what do you think the future holds for things like that seem quite novel, in 2025, but perhaps they have a history, and perhaps we'll see some action on that. So a little bit of that. Thanks.
You're actually being asked for some historical context.
Yes, so on briefing books, yes, absolutely. I know that there were briefing books prepared for the transition, as there always are. Any transition, the people in all, not just in the State Department, every single government bureau, in the White House, everywhere, prepare briefing books, which they hand off to their successors. So the Africa Bureau hands to the Africa Bureau, the political undersecretary hands to his counterpart, et cetera. And then there's, like the secretary gets the very consolidated, only the headlines and the most important pieces that matter bit. Absolutely, and they are read. They are absolutely read. Are they used? That depends on whether the new administration wants to use them or not. But they are absolutely read, and people do a lot of briefings as well. So when I came in as the acting assistant secretary for international organizations in the middle of the pandemic in early 2021, so January 20th, 2021, at 2:00 in the afternoon, I walked into my office. And there was a big, huge briefing book sitting on my desk saying, these are all the issues, and with 2 papers on top with these are the things you must act on in the first 48 hours, like big deal things that you need to get moving. And I got a lot of briefings over video on the unclassified stuff, and then very carefully bringing in small groups of people because nobody was vaccinated at that point. And we all sat like way far away from each other in these huge rooms with like 6 people, in them to do the classified briefings. But Security Council meetings were going on via video and everything else, and so we had to continue on because the world doesn't stop working just because we have a transition. So absolutely, those things are used. Sorry, the second. Greenland. Yes, there is a pass to this. So. Wonderful account. The State Department historian has a great LinkedIn account. If you just type in LinkedIn State Department historian, and they release declassified papers, in 20 or 25 or 50 years, whenever they're declassified. And there's a huge ream of papers about Russia complaining that Denmark hadn't kicked us out of air bases that we built during World War II on Greenland. And they were pressuring Denmark as they were invading Finland. And all these papers have been released in the last 2 months. And there's this whole back and forth about whether we should try and buy Greenland. And the Danes saying, it's not for sale, and the people of Greenland actually have a vote. And, we're talking about air bases here, not about purchasing anything. And there's this whole back and forth where our president raised this several times our then president raised it several times with the prime minister. So yes, there is an analog to this. Yes, Greenland has been important for a long time. Yes, the Russians have hated our presence there for a long time. And history is useful. I urge you to look at the State Department historian's account. It's
We may
fascinating.
crash that server after this
It's
event.
fascinating.
So you remain an optimist, it seems, and so I just want to speak. Like if I was a student at Dartmouth and I was interested in being in the world of diplomacy, it certainly changed from when you entered. And we didn't even get to your Jacques Cousteau story about how you weren't going to be a diplomat. What would you recommend to students today if they're interested in this field?
I would say explore. Go and do internships at the State Department, at NGOs, at international organizations. Work on the Hill with the Foreign Affairs Committee or with people who work with them. Go and explore the different ways you can be involved in international policy, because diplomacy and working for the U.S. government is one route. There's many, many, many different routes, and there's way more than there used to be, because NGOs have a much bigger presence internationally than they used to, and international NGOs are proliferating all over the place and actually have a much bigger voice in decision-making than they used to, which is a good thing. International press is also really, really important and much less divided than our own press is in some ways, and much more universal, and is very interesting. International organizations, they do work on everything from migration to telecommunications to health to you name it, development, on and on. So there's lots of different paths, so go out and explore. Try different things and figure out what you're good at and what you like, and what you go home and you go, yeah, I killed it today, because you want your job to be like that. You want your job to have those, yeah, I really knocked it out of the park today moments. Every job is gonna have the, oh my God, I tore my eyeballs out today, boring, awful days. Every job is gonna have that. I have had that in every single job I've done, where it's just like, it has been a bureaucratic nightmare of just like, I can't stand it. But you want those to be the small minority of days, and the big majority of days to be like, okay, I'm making steady progress, I'm clicking along, and and then every once in a while you get one of those really like, yes, we got it done days. So go out and figure out where those are and what gives you that yes feeling. And then go do more of that, because we need people working on all these issues and in all these different fields and working together. And then keep up your networks, because you never know when somebody who sat next to you in class is going to be the person who hires you, or who you can help get a job, or who ends up showing up at a cocktail party randomly in New Delhi, and suddenly they're telling you information that is really useful to you, and you can help somebody else get a job, which happened to me. So those are the kind of things that, keep up your networks, keep up your professional networks, your friend networks, and just go out and, figure out what you love and where you can make a difference, and then go do more of that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Erica Barks Ruggles, for joining us tonight for the great conversation.